And all this together definitely leads to sustainability. Sustenance is at the core of conservation, and it's a powerful tool to conservation. So then people ask nominal questions like, and whenever it suits them, they ask these questions: what is a historic building anyway? And why would you conserve a historic building? If it has lived its life, why don't you let it go? People also live their life, and we let them go. And they die a natural deaths. But for conservation and for historic buildings, if we are able to doctor them, if we are able to analyze that they still have a lease of life, and if they can still be sustained for the sake of sustainability, then why not? So, what is a historic building all about? And the sense of wonder, which is so immensely high in a human psyche, a human being is built with a sense of wonder. And even now, I'm sure the entire fraternity of architects and people who are into the visual domain of spaces always reacts with a sense of wonder when one sees an old building and wants to know more about it. And what does he want to know? That is not very clear. And so the research and the education approach makes it clear. And it makes it clear in its architectural, aesthetic, historic documentary, and all these various values that it possesses. And it is these values that become the symbol of cultural identity. And that is why it needs to be conserved. And it does have a lease of life. So why let it go? So that is why conserve. And what is conservation? Very simple. It just prevents decay. It gives it a lease of life. A human being's limb is broken, one goes to the doctor to amend or to rectify the decay, and life goes on. And that is what conservation is all about. You prevent decay. What is the difference between conservation and preservation then? So preservation was something that Archaeological Survey of India motivated. Because at that point of time, it was the British who had done it in their country, and they knew the meaning and the levels of integrity that it would bring to communities. And so they set up Archaeological Survey of India and identified the stock right at the onset. And it is only this ASI as a body which has protected the monuments that we see today. So hats off to them over these hundreds of years that they have protected them. But there is another stock which is in the hands of the living human being. They are not monuments. People live in them, and it needs to change. So managing change is something that needs to be sustained. Change is inevitable, and conservation architects understand this very well, that it is inevitable. Change has to be only managed depending upon the value systems that it possesses. And what should that change be? How should it be controlled? And so on. Managing change leads to writing design control guidelines for conservation, and that is what leads and makes a place for itself in the development plan practices. And that is how our development control regulations has only one clause, one section which talks about conservation. And so the life cycle begins with identification of these values. It's a very scientific process which has been advised over a period of time by people who have been dealing with this. So when one sees identification of values, it is a very detailed process with a scientific approach to it. It is written down as records. It has a line of defense built into it so that tomorrow nobody says a common thing that I have heard every time is that my building is only having one staircase which is of a certain age, and you are classifying it as heritage. How do I live in that building? And so things like that. So line of defense is built up only if this assessment of cultural significance, it's a technical term under UNESCO, and if this key concept is built up and written down as a record with a total built up of line of defense, then that becomes a document and it can then convert into a DCR or a development control regulation. And so these are a few list of values that one can look at: emotional, cultural, use values, because we're talking of conservation where we want to manage the change, and therefore it is always in use. These buildings are used over a period of time. And so its use values have to be analyzed so that it can be given a lease of life for a different use, maybe what we call as adaptive reuse, cases of which we will discuss as we go on. And so what is this entire environment under which heritage can be divided into? And it goes into this two main formats as cultural and natural. Cultural, natural together will make up this whole wider environment into which human beings thrive. And that can be further divided into tangible and intangible. And all the value assessments are done within this web that you see by using a specific process. It ends into making what is known as list cards. Once the asset is identified, it goes into making a list card like this. One is from Matharan on the left-hand side, and the right-hand side is from Virar. The assets are different. One is a building, the other one is a precinct in which there is a water body. And so the earlier chart kind of manifests itself in this list. This is a list card which is to be in the regime of normal people, citizens, and also becomes a guide for heritage committees. So the last line here is should it be controlled? And that is a clue that heritage committees take. Restoring buildings, sustainability, all this then becomes the game which the conservation architects play. The most sustainable thing to do by any human being is not to build. That's what ecologists would say: do not touch it. And that is the same thing that conservation architects would say, that do not build new buildings as long as you're able to give a lease of life to the existing, because that direct emissions. It entails into reduction of embodied carbon, and therefore renovation of existing buildings is a call of the day. That is a practice that we follow. A very simple cycle of materials. The old buildings used not cement but lime. The origin of lime was from stone. It was converted only in chemical state and physical state so that it can be worked upon and brought into practice of making buildings. Eventually, it goes back and becomes stone. So calcium carbonate turns a whole cycle, turns into quicklime, becomes calcium hydroxide when water is added to it for workability, converted into mortar when it is applied to building. With again carbon dioxide in the air, it becomes stone. This is a cycle which gives a lease of life to heritage buildings. And that is why you'll see monuments. They don't fall apart as easily as buildings built with cement. Cement also uses the same ingredient, but it is kind of maneuvered for only one reason, and that is for faster setting. That's all.
Kirtida, very fascinating so far, and I'm so glad you highlighted, how sustainability also plays a huge role, especially in terms of understanding material. I think at this point it'll be great if you can also take us through, the recent projects that you've worked on. If you can maybe summarize that for us and talk about, highlight those as well. But very interesting so far. Yes.
Yes. And so all this goes into the aspects of conserving a building. So from value assessment to establishment of significance to providing a sound base. And then you have these different ways in which repair restoration is taken into account. whether it goes into use, a different use, whether it is a protected monument and it needs to be refurbished so that it can have a lease of life through tourism and it gets a funding lease of life and so on. So all this, and so each experience is then explored in wider context. So from a single asset, as I was saying, it goes into different environments of macro to micro and within each of these regimes. So I will discuss my uh, projects under this wider canvas, from wider context, wider environments to singular buildings. So if one looks at Matharan, then in all these other projects, all these are larger projects. So look at Matharan. If you look at Matharan, the listing proposal eventually went on to become an eco-sensitive zone, which was only the third or the fourth eco-sensitive zone, which was only based on evaluation for cultural significance and so on. And today, all the buildings in Matharan, just based on that research, is protected. I have done one building in Matharan using my same own principle. So the second one that I dealt with was conservation management plan for World Heritage Site, which was the Elephanta Island. And it was done under the aegis of INTAC, Mumbai again. And it went on a huge journey where the State Department set up a steering committee so that everything that is entailed in the context of change is managed correctly. And then you have a small precinct in Mumbai, which is the Kambala Hill precinct, which is lying on the east of the Hughes Road, which is this, and it's a little hill which has an escarpment at the back, which was negotiated and endangered at some point of time. And this was taken up in detail to identify what should be the extent in which change can be managed. So what should be the listing entail, and what should be allowed to just rest as it is. But coexistence of listed buildings in a precinct with non-listed buildings is the game. And that is where design comes into focus. And that is a whole game which has been now negated. And if anybody is reading the papers, last 2 days, BMC is out to kill this process. And we have lost the game. We have lost the game of almost 40 years, and we are going down the drain. And without hesitation, I'm announcing this.
That must definitely hurt a little bit, Kirtida, that there is a setback of this scale and measure.
It's a huge setback.
Hmm.
And it is only because the system is ill-informed. It is not informed correctly.
Yeah.
People sitting at the helm are not informed.
Hmm.
Short-term gains. And then, as I said,
precedent.
True. So that is what is happening. And so you have my other projects. You have Bar House. This was in Matharan. This was for a company which was called Nimrana Hotels, and took it up in a big way. One can look up Nimrana Hotels, the kind of work they've done in the country. And as somebody who was not even an Indian, and to understand the uniqueness of hill stations in the country. And then you have what Sneha just mentioned this was a break point for me personally, because one would have never imagined. I'd always dreamt that this building would be done by me, and the dream came true. It was involved in it for about 10 years before I took up this project, only because my CA sat in that building and I was constantly visiting the building, and then he induced the rest of the people who were owners and leaseholders to have it conserved. It did not happen. It went the wrong way. It went into a court case. And there was a new owner who came up, who had this huge vision that if he is capable and if he enables conservation, then there is a huge amount of funding revenue that he can generate in an area like Fort Precinct. So it is always a fund. And what is it that you can invest? And what is the return that one gets? That becomes a driver for protection and conservation. On the right-hand side is one of the first buildings ever built on the island city, and that is a Bombay castle with a naval dock. So I was very fortunate to work with the naval dockyard for a long period of time and done several projects inside and on the periphery outside. And then you have one of, as I said, one of my most favorite projects, which is in the same hues as it was intended to be, the Juma Masjid at Crawford Market. In this case, it was a Friends of Juma Masjid who came forward, made a corpus of funding, and approached me only for painting. And I refused right at the onset, saying it cannot be done. And he said, why not? And I answered the question, why not? And he said, all right. So we go full-fledged, and full-fledged we did go. And the entire funding was raised by the Friends, who's still a great friend. So that is what the components which is on in the wider environment beyond the regime of buildings is things like environment which prevails in the setting of conservation areas and conservation cities by large. And so Matharan, eventually after 10 years being on the Heritage Committee, we could identify street furniture. And there was a whole master plan which was prepared for street furniture, so that there's a coexistence in the nature of design of the furniture of the place, which coexists with the built heritage. And that is a coexistence with which, right at the onset, the British designed hill stations. And one has to go by that ethos. And Matharan, especially because it is the only pedestrian hill station in Asia. And that is also being revoked now. And a lot of things have been done. And so if you look at places like Matharan, then you have this cohesive kind of environment which one has to tackle. And then how do you make list cards? It's one of the most difficult processes to identify in this larger and a wider setting of how do you make list cards and what do you include in the list cards. And if you go back there, all this was included in the list cards. The built, the natural, and the cohesive. All of them made list cards. And that stood the test of time. So when it went for a final test in the Supreme Court upheld it. And the report went on to become a part and parcel of the notification, which became an eco-sensitive zone. It was a huge battle won by Bombay Environmental Action Group. I am still supporting it but only from the margins. So people like Bombay Environmental Action Group create these backgrounds. I'll go faster here. I would just like to stay on the research that is dealt with to create list cards. And the same thing happened for Kambala Hill. Kambala Hill also is a hill, coincidentally, just like Madara. Only thing is that its setting was in the urban context. And therefore, the identification of the list and the method followed for cultural significance changed a little bit. And then we had to deal with everything, like I had to set up guidelines for demolition and reconstruction, listing and unlisting, urban form and townscape, architectural control for infill buildings. And so this brings in the whole set of architects to do various things in the same precinct. So that's a lesson to be learned. The list cards, the mapping that is done. And then recently I got this opportunity to work for a smart city, Diu, in Gujarat. And here the entire process was led by Heritage. The people who made the case for the smart city, they led it by conservation. And it was accepted. And so this is an ongoing process currently. I am dealing at the moment only with the heritage buildings, but the smartness of the approach was something that I could lend from my experience of the wider settings of Matharan and other areas. Another place, a very small street, which is a precinct in Virar. And this was an area action plan. So this is one step ahead of proclaiming guidance for conservation areas or precincts. And
So,
then this
Kirtida,
is,
are you still involved in the with the Mathiran project, Kambala project? Like I remember, because you and I know each other since so long, and I remember you talking about Mathiran also back then. So, is your involvement still there with the Mathiran committee? And since the due is very new, like can you maybe also talk about like timelines and what has been your involvement? Maybe if you can just maybe touch upon that as well.
so Mathiran, very quickly, I started the
Yeah,
process in 1996.
yeah,
I'm still on the committee.
yeah. You're still on the committee as well,
I'm
right?
still
Yeah.
on the committee.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
and
due, when did you start working on due?
it started just before onset of COVID.
I'm
And
sorry. Yeah.
COVID was 1919.
Okay. In 1990. Okay. Okay. Right. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt as well because I'm a little wary of time. Just want to also ask all our audience members here today. If you have any questions for Kirtida, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll open out for questions now. Kirtida, maybe if you'd like to wrap up this last project, and then we can just have a quick conversation. And then we can see if there are any audience questions, which a few of them are coming in already. Yeah,
So I'll skip the elephanta thing, but I'll
yeah.
lead you some
Do you want to talk
pictures
about
of
Juma? Yeah, since this is your favorite.
Juma
Yeah,
Masjid. Yes, so Juma Masjid is a structure which was
yeah,
built on a water body. It is entirely standing on water. And it's a fascinating sight to see. And built in the year 1775 sometime with the foundations in water. So technically and technologically, it would be at a very high place of mention, and it still survives. The foundations are intact, and so on. And the rate of change that we afforded it was under the scriptures of the religion, Islam, which proclaims that the the space in which Allah is revered has to change over a period of time, and it has to be enhanced. And it is an enhancement scheme, besides the restoration, of course, that went a long way in the restoration of in looking into this project. I'm still involved with it, done various phases in it, and the next phase is still on. So that is, and you can see this lovely pictures of before and after.
yeah.
The
It's beautiful.
enhancement that I'm talking about, bringing alive the original materials back to life, which was covered in coats of paint in 7-8 layers, was unearthed. And we added lights and things like that, but of the same typology
Right.
that we found there. But it was designed fresh. So conservation and design, it goes into this, and this speaks for itself.
Yeah, I was just kind of going to
Yes.
note that as well, because that's something that I quickly noted down. How you said, conservation, it ends with design and it begins with design, and that is so reminiscent across all the projects that you just talked about, including Juma Masjid. It's just such a beautiful structure.
Yes, because you
Yeah.
live through the life of the designer originally.
Yeah.
Get into his skin,
Mm.
and then you resurrect. And this is the project that most of you might have seen, people from Mumbai. This is just opened up. And you
Yeah.
can see the state that it was in. One would never even envisage. And one thing that I would like to say very prominently here is that this is not a listed building. It is only sitting in the precinct. And the client was so happy with what he saw at Zara that he came asking. And this is what we could achieve. And we had a very good user now, which is Anita Dongre, who respected the space to the ultimate and have done the interiors. One has to walk inside to see the interiors. It's not done by me. So collaboration again here. So we have outsiders who come and use the spaces that we have conserved, and they seek our advice in what they should do and what they should not do. A kind of a guideline is written down for them, or it is conveyed to them verbally. If they are good users, they would come to you 10 times in a day and ask you questions. And that is what Anita Dongre did. I'm very thankful to the designers at Anita Dongre and the proprietors who own the stores.
Yeah. There's
And
Madhu.
Brian.
Yeah, there's someone, Madhu Rakesh, who's messaged on the chat saying, I would really like to visit in person. Yes, you should, because these before and after pictures don't do justice to the kind of work that has been carried on of this buildings. And if you're in Bombay or you are in living in Bombay, you should definitely just go and pay a visit, and maybe even reach out to Kirtida, to give you more insights. Yeah,
So,
go ahead, Kirtida. Yeah.
so one of the projects that we are doing today, and as you know, Sneha, very clearly,
Yeah.
because you interviewed me on this some years before, my collaboration with Afghan Church, this was my very first project after I came back from my scholarship. So 1996 till today. And
Wow.
it was me and my great friend, Swati Chandgadkar, who is a stained glass conservationist, who stuck to this project. And we approached World Monument Fund, India. And luckily for us, World Monument Fund India, Amita Beg was one of the prominent persons who was a friend of Afghan Church even before I had entered in 1996. And so we were conferred with a holistic budget for the first time. I've done phases of restorations for Afghan Church since 1996, some 5 phases, against my will, of course, because I always wanted holistic. And the pastorate committee, because of the dearth of funds that they have, could not ever think of such. So it's such a huge collaboration with the owners, the custodians, architects. Within my architectural practice, I have a list of big um, collaborators where we have collaborations from art historians, art restorers. Mr. Anupam Saha is on the group,
Oh, wow.
and we have Swati Chandgadkar, we have landscape architects, and we have lighting designers, and we also have acoustical designers.
Hmm.
And so that's what has brought this project together.
That's a huge collaborative effort, Kirtida, that you have like
Yes,
distinctive teams, technical teams for different aspects of the Afghan church. And for you to be working on this monument for plus 20 plus years, in fact, a lot more than
30
that. Yeah.
plus.
30
30.
plus years now. It's amazing. Yeah. I can see S. Sarani asking, does the restoration of the Afghan church eventually include the bishop quarters located in a separate plot? Is that also part of it, or does it not have one? Yeah.
Part of it, that plot
Not a
is under litigation for many years.
It's under litigation at the moment, right?
It's a part and parcel of the pastorate committee,
Mm.
but it is under litigation.
Right,
Long
right, right.
time, and they're
Yeah.
trying very hard to get out of it. So we were talking about digital documentation techniques, and I
Mm.
have used these techniques right at the onset, but never have we come so close to getting it right. And so now we have that consultancy as well to give us this digital documentation techniques. We fall short and we are not too sure about its finer manifestations because point clouds and modeling does not give us the 2D drawings that we need to the extent that we need it. But it does help in a big way to give us accuracy in the documentation process. And we also had initially the original glass slides from the British Council. This was, I'm saying, in 1996. So we could corroborate.
Yeah, and it is, I remember when Kirtida interviewed you many moons ago, you talking about this and the numerous roadblocks, whether it's from local authorities, from litigation, from even like people who wanted to like shoot there. Like I remember that so distinctively. So I'm sure there must have been so much learning from you, and even in terms of what I do admire personally is, conservation architects like you, the determination, the way you balance determination, perseverance, and patience is something that needs to be noted as well, right? Because yes, we talk about, yes, having the knowledge, having the research, aptitude for research, And even knowing, techniques like this, documentation technique like this, for you to be able to, perform that restoration. But I also think these core skills make so much of a difference, right? In terms of relationship building, in terms of just being like, perseverant and, um, you know, um, ensuring that, what you want at the end of the day is what is delivered. So yeah, I'm quite curious as to how you go about championing those people skills, and how do you translate that to your team as well, your very young and beautiful team.
Yes. So personally, I'm a very short-tempered person.
You
Uh,
you don't come across it at all.
I lose it very fast.
Yeah,
But because we have a focus, and it is a focus which drives us.
yeah,
So any nonsense that is going on around us is ignored, and we keep the focus,
yeah,
especially in cases like this where we have funding from uh, a very legitimate source, and we cannot do anything which is not up to the integrity of the practice. And so we keep the focus. Basically, that is what drives us.
yeah.
And because of the focus, we have all the other tenets. So we have the perseverance, and we have the flexibility, and each one of us has different quotients of each, and
Right,
we balance each other.
right,
So we have two conservation architects working with us. One
right.
of them one of them is on site. She's a
Okay.
site supervisor.
Hmm.
So she's a PMC actually, and she's a conservation architect. Interned with me in
Hmm.
Zara, and came back and did her master's in intangible conservation, and now is a driver, the driving force on site. Uh,
Lovely. That's
so,
amazing.
so that is how it is coordinated.
Right.
I have
Yeah.
structural engineers who are also my PMC, and so they are a huge gang, especially for the tower that you see here, the spire. For all
Hmm.
of you to know, the spire holds 8 gigantic bells in them, and the structural system today is failing. And
Yeah.
to keep it in that location, hoisted up without any disturbance, is a huge task.
Can
And
only imagine.
so things like that, so technically, um, the mindset, the focus, the perseverance to build up relationships at all angles, relationships with the owners,
Hmm.
stakeholders, and so on. And the church has to run throughout this journey.
Hmm.
We cannot stop the church. So
Yeah.
services go on on Sundays. Same with Afghan church, same with Juma Masjid.
Juma Masjid as well. Yeah.
Services went on.
It
And
is. It is in working. I mean, as in people visit it. They offer their prayers.
yes,
It is functioning. Yeah.
yes. Even
Kirtida, I really wish we could go on, because this is
I
so
understand.
informative. There are some questions coming in as well, so if I can maybe just address some of them, maybe you can answer them while you maybe highlight some questions. So as Dr. S.P. Anchuri asks, government attitudes towards conservation depends on leadership, economic priorities, focuses. We were talking about this. You mentioned this a little earlier today. Um, Everyone's ignoring this because of public pressure. Experts can conserve only if they are given a task, but why do they lack influencing the need for conservation? So basically, Dr. Anshuli is talking about government attitudes, lack of awareness, resource constraints, ideology by politics and industry. Things are ignored because there are other demands by the public. But why do they lack influencing the need for conservation? It'd be
So
interesting
it's
to hear your thoughts, Kirtida, since you sit on
yes,
so many committees too and liaise with local authorities in Bombay. Yeah.
yes, it's a sad state of affairs. But nonetheless, the efforts that were made by city fathers way back in 1991 and throughout this period, one of the reasons is, yes, lack of um, focus, as I said,
Yeah.
lack of focus, lack of, or rather short-sightedness and
Hmm.
pressures, succumbing to pressures. One of the principal reasons why experts have not been able to influence is, and I would lend it to just one thing. There are in our development plan, we have overarching development control regulations. If we just identify the special buildings which are listed and relieve the overarching policies levied upon them, then one does not need parking as much as it would require for a nominal building. You might have noticed, Dr. Anchuri, that in Mumbai, all the high-rise buildings today have ground and 10 upper only for parking, because that's a regulation. And so
Yeah.
if anybody wants to reconstruct a building within a precinct, an unlisted building has a right to change. We allow that. But what we restrict is the character. And one of the principal tenets of character in a precinct is to look at the height of the building. Maintain the skyline is a regulation. So you may build a new building. It may talk today's language because we allow change. Because it is today's architecture which will become tomorrow's heritage. It has to have that quality. And conservation architects recognize that quality. But if it is a precinct as sacrosanct as Fort Precinct, then the overarching policies have to be relieved. If those are relieved, then the automatic rights of selling the sale rights which are given over and above rehabilitating the people who are already residing, that same amount of FSI is given for sale. And so the building rises up. The plot is small. It is narrow. It sits on the narrow. So it is all these dynamics which needed to be relieved. And if you see the MMRHCS studies, they are available online. And if you look at all the studies done by experts on areas like Kotachivadi, they all proclaim the same thing, that do not cross the existing character. And what does character comprise of? We are not stopping new buildings. We are not saying do not build new. We are not saying do not demolish buildings which are not in a good state and it is a risk to human life. But build it in a way which is responsible. But if you give them the rights of funds over and above what they can build, then there's an automatic kind of incentive which is given to them. So it's an inverse incentive given.
Absolutely. And even character is something that is open to interpretation, but where you come to a consensus between you and the authorities who have the power to, release funding and also allow for conservation to flourish, right? So yes, absolutely. Understanding the need for character. In the interest of time, what I'll just do is quickly just make a poll live because we'd like to get the audience here to get their opinion too about how we can build and design stronger conservation practices as well. It's a multiple choice question, so we'd love to hear from you. So Rudra, if you can please help making poll 3 live, please, how we can build and design stronger conservation practices. And while everyone is taking 2 seconds to answer, Kirtida, we have a few questions about material as well. A lot of people have asked, how some of the changes, like Ankita asked, how some changes in the material finishes of the building, whether how much of the original material is usually retained, how do you go about doing that? Is there a limit to how much you can replace, or does that, how much does that matter project to project? Yeah.
So to answer that question from the technical point of view, conservation teaches you to respect materials. So just to give it a lease of life. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. If everyone's answered the poll, we can make it live in a minute. Yeah,
so the lease of life to a building is a very scientific process. The materials used in all buildings need to be like to like, because new materials, say for instance, cement used on stone will kill the stone.
Hmm.
And so therefore, whenever we find cement, in fact, we look for areas which have cement when we start identifying defects.
Yeah.
So our defect identification begins with where is cement used. So in the period of the lifetime of the building, people have done restoration, right? In an ignorant manner, not knowing that a
Hmm.
certain material that cannot coexist scientifically, and it is rather leading to its death. And so it is this kind of technical expertise that is required to determine what extent of change can be allowed. So, for instance, lime plaster will have to go back to lime plaster.
Hmm.
It, if it is stone behind, it cannot take cement plaster. So, it is not a fashion. It is not for enhancing architecture. It is for giving it a new lease of life. So, that is a restriction that with which one works in with materials. What extent? The extent is determined by the state of conservation of the building in which it is today. When I say the state, I mean the
Yeah.
state of deterioration in which it is.
Yeah.
And that is what will determine of how much change for new materials. And we do not um, disallow new technologies. We always go for it.
Hmm.
We also look at technologies which can be amenable in today's context to um, give it a new lease of life. Structural systems, new roofing materials, new materials instead of timber. If timber is too expensive and not available easily, it is too expensive for the client to afford. And if it is not something which is against the technicalities, then we do allow that change. So
Right.
timber can become steel and things like that. So all this is through the research that I've been emphasizing all this time.
So
So
research does play a huge role, of course, and kind of ensuring that there's, wherever possible, there is technology, amenable technology, as you mentioned. Right.
yes,
Rudra, if you can help make the result live, please, where we asked everyone about how do we make stronger conservation practices. Yes, interestingly, stronger collaborations, and Kirtida, you pointed that out as well. And yeah, everyone said all of the above. But maybe it would be interesting to note. I think S. Irani, I wanted to also ask that question because knowing that Kirtida is an educator, and would love to know if there is anything, and if I would maybe add to what S. Irani is asking um, about education in conservation, right? Do you think, in terms of design and architecture education, conservation needs to be explained or even demonstrated or even showcased or case studied more efficiently, more from the context of empathy? Maybe if you'd like to share your thoughts here too, Kirtida, as an educator as well.
sure. So as I said originally, when we learned history of architecture, we were not taught in a way that uh, one would respect the monuments and the history, but
Hmm.
never thought of restoration at all. In all these years, it didn't come uh, even to closest to my mind personally, till we met like-minded people. And to even mention the like-minded person is known to everybody is because Dilaveri. He,
Yes, of course.
as a young conservation person, is who I met, and he inculcated in a group of us as to what is all this.
Hmm.
And that is how we started a close group to look into this conservation. So we were urban planners, conservation architects, uh,
Yeah.
myself as just an architect at that point of time, and also urban designers. And we made a group. And it is this which facilitated the education part of it till one would venture into going for a formal education. So there are colleges which offer conservation courses.
Hmm.
Uh,
Right.
very few, but they are there. SPA Delhi is one of the most premier,
Hmm.
and you have CEPT
Sept as well. Correct. Yeah.
at Ahmedabad, which offers, uh, and the line that they toe is very different. So,
Hmm.
and then you have SPA Bhopal,
Right.
and one or two IITs also offer that. IIT
Right.
Madras has one of the most heightened courses in conservation engineering.
Mm.
So these are the way. But if you come to undergrad studies, undergrad studies over a period of time have progressed into looking at different regimes of um, eligibilities
Mm.
in surround architecture, in the sense architecture studies which is surrounded with specialities that the students can latch on to. And
Right.
conservation is one of those.
Mm.
And so I also conduct and have been conducting a lot of electives in different colleges, besides teaching the master's course as a visiting lecturer um, for a period of time. So all these are the education regimes. So undergrad architects are now seeking internships with people like myself.
That's amazing.
So if I
That
would
means
tell
the
you,
awareness is there. Yeah.
I wouldn't get an intern, I would say about 15 years back, because
Mm.
they were told not to intern with conservation architects in their colleges.
They were discouraged too.
They were discouraged that
Mm.
you will not qualify if
Yeah.
you work. So things like that. But
Yeah.
now there is a lot of education which is
Mm.
happening at the undergrad level as well. So
Right.
it's a happy note.
No, but like I said, Kirtida, I wish we could continue because it's been so inspiring,
Oh,
and I'm
yes.
sure the audience also agrees. In fact, we had such a good mix of both senior and young startups who are in conservation. So I'm sure they found value in what you had to share today. There were a few other questions as well. What we will do is maybe forward them to Kirtida, and in her own time, she can answer them,
Yes,
and
surely.
we can forward them across to you. But yes, I really appreciate you sharing your time and your insights and your knowledge with us, Kirtida, which I'm sure our education would have not been able to provide in the process. So thank you. All the very best with your projects. I hope to also meet you in person and
Sure.
maybe visit Afghan Church, especially, and even Juma Masjid. I would love to see both
Sure.
those projects. For those who join in, a lot of you are asking whether we can share the presentation. Well, the recording will be live on Godrej's Facebook page, so you can revisit this talk, this recording, and we will, of course, continue with the series. We will let you know when the next when the next episode, sorry, will be released. We will also share a feedback form with you very shortly on the chat. Rudra, if you can share the feedback form. We'd love to hear your suggestions, who you'd like to see next. But we do hope that you enjoyed today's session, and we hope to see you next time. Kirtida, once again, thank you so much for spending your Friday evening with us. And we will connect with all of you very soon. Thank you. Have a good
Thank you.
weekend, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.